So the question before us today is, I often fear God as a tyrant. How can I change that? So I actually think this is a very good and rather common question as well, because I think sometimes people can have perceptions of the religious life as this kind of unnecessary pitting between my will and the divine will, and that there's kind of this unnecessary subjugation of my own self to just be obedient aimlessly or blindly, and hence the actions of God can seem like that of a tyrant, as oppressive, and such of the like. But I think I'll kind of spell out my long answer, but then I'll kind of give my short answer, which is that if we have our own existence categories, as I'll call them, if they're out of whack, then it may very well appear to be the case that God is a tyrant, but of course it's not actually the case that God is a tyrant within himself, right? Because I think one important theological point to remember is that God can only will things or actions which only find an end back to himself. And I think it seems almost paradoxical to think in this way, but consider it. God's knowledge, God's justice, God's goodness, wisdom, grace, and especially his creative acts all have a direction towards an end which is only to himself. And now think about how radical of a point that is. This would certainly seem like God is the ultimate kind of megalomaniac, right? He is perhaps, in other words, the greatest narcissist that could have ever been conceived by human imagination. And then, of course, we turn our attention to Jesus, who perhaps also may be considered the greatest narcissist in all of human history, right? All of those times where he said, "Follow me," or "Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say?" All these have indications, perhaps anyway, of someone who is only for the preservation of their own agenda. Now, likewise, imagine if God's actions were directed towards some other end that wasn't to himself. Paradoxically, I think it's this direction towards other ends other than himself that makes God actually selfish or a tyrant. Because imagine if God was subjected towards desires, pleasures, and longings in order to experience satisfaction, gratification, or the like. God, in that way, no longer is self-sustaining and self-actualizing, but is only subject to a process of realizing potentials or realizing possibilities. There then happens this kind of radical openness in the being of God to incessantly fulfill actualities, which are really foreign to his nature. And so it's definitely hard, and I think probably just downright weird to think about that. But it's also amazing and wonderful that God being directed to himself and himself alone is actually what makes him selfless. There's probably, I think, another philosophical way that we can think about this, especially with reference to God's love, or God being love. So whenever we make a judgment about a thing, we are identifying that this thing is such that. So for example, this piece of metal is such that it is round. It is 5 pounds, is of a dark gray color, and so on and so forth. So in identifying something, our judgments about it are making a kind of representation of the thing. If the judgment actually corresponds to what the thing is, then we have made a true representation. However, Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, had us think about this process on an altogether different sort of way. Rather than represent something, we instead present it, which means to allow the thing to surge up before us in the guise of this or that object, but in such a way that the judgment lets itself be led by the thing. So what this means is that the presenting object, let's refer back to the piece of metal earlier, it's placed between us and the light, thus letting the object appear and manifest itself to us through the way it actually is. So now from here we can consider in the case of the love of God. So in a way, we always will fall short whenever we try to make a representation of God's love, for the simple reason that God's love is infinite. Hence, whatever characterization we make of the sort, God's love is such that X, Y, and Z, we would never be able to transgress the limit of what judgments are relative to God's love, because it's never ending. Hence, God's love is not merely just X, Y, or Z. Instead, God's love is not represented to us, but it is presented to us. We have an encounter, in other words, with God's love that is only made manifest to the individual subject. Even though God may perform a public miracle towards a vast audience, for example, the spiritual direction of that miracle is only appropriated to the individual. Hence, such a public event, hypothetically speaking, is even able to carry an encounter such that it is as if God had directed it only towards one single individual. And this is why some individuals in the public miracle, they're able to appropriate it within a context of faith, whereas others are instead able to appropriate the same miracle that others have experienced within a context of offense. So we look at this kind of example all throughout the New Testament with the case of the hypocrisy of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? We have an audience who is viewing this public miracle, but given the different personalities and dispositions, and perhaps the kind of relation to grace that all these individuals have, we see different responses nonetheless. And that's curious because they're seeing the same thing, but that's because whenever they're presenting the event to their own understanding, it becomes appropriated within a context that either ends in faith or in offense. And so I would say that the experience of God's direction for your life depends on the degree to which His will or His love for you is being presented. And so that's why I say His will for some individuals can seem tyrannical or seem oppressive, because the presentation of His direction for your life might seem contrary to your own desires. And indeed, they might be radically contrary. But the problem, strictly speaking, here would be with us, and of course not with God. And so the fundamental issue, I think, comes down to examining what it is exactly that we want. What is the direction of our own desires, our own longings, and our own pursuits, such that they don't have a finality in God? And I think the more and more of these goals or ends that we find ourselves pursuing, perhaps consciously or unconsciously, we'll see how our own pursuits kind of become a frustration when put under the umbrella of God's will for our lives, right? And it's just looking at the more fundamental point that since all things find an end in God, it's either the case that one is either successfully striving towards that end or unsuccessfully. And so the problem isn't so much having to do with God Himself, but perhaps our pictures of God, the kind of idols that we've set up in our own minds that we think worth pursuing or worth giving glory to, but yet there's a kind of spiritual fatigue that kind of envelops because we aren't pursuing God's will as it actually should obtain in our own lives. And there's a lot of ways I think we could fix that, but I think first and foremost we have to look at that question through a lens of self-examination, because in this way we're being on watch for whatever pitfalls or obstacles might be standing in the way, which most succinctly stated, could be just ourselves. So it's important to look at that, of course, on the one hand, but then look at my own desires and seeing if I even want to pursue God's will in the first place. It's really an honest kind of search to look at. So that's kind of my answer to the question. I think if I went too heavy or too high in the philosophical clouds, I kind of apologize for that. But that's just kind of my understanding of the issue, that it's interesting to think of that paradox of God only willing the end of Himself as being the only true selfless act, whereas everybody else in the created order has directions that they can take up for themselves. We have a will where we can choose ends other than God. So I think there has to be this balanced dialectic between freedom and, of course, being subjected to God's will. And there's a hand-in-hand kind of openness when I think the spiritual life has found a flourishing kind of means for that. So, yeah.